Hi, so let's kick off with some of the headlines from the last 2 weeks. Um, it's been a really, really crazy ride, really. We've had Ingersoll in Germany announce a 100 million euro grant. Los Angeles and the World Economic Forum have developed a new blueprint for UAM. Joby has got a new air taxi out. Boeing is exiting temporarily or permanently. We don't know this space. Hyundai is upping its game. Toyota is also announced a new investment. And I bought a ticket to the first commercial volocopter ride within 3 years within Europe. €30 down payment, €300 for the whole thing. So those are my headlines. Quite a lot to talk about.
My word, a lot to talk about, a lot to unpack there. It's hard. Normally you look at the headlines and you think, oh, here's the theme for this week. That's pretty clear. But gosh, there's a lot in there. Let's start though, maybe, Phil, what's your thinking on, well, two things you mentioned. One was motor car manufacturers, Hyundai and Toyota, are coming into this sector and all of a sudden are looking at flying taxis as a fleet of motor vehicles, if you like, or certainly equivalent. Whereas Boeing is getting out of the sector, sort of making us think that it's less about flying taxis and more about taxis, or it's less about flying and more about taxis. Do you think that's a strategic decision from Boeing about the sector, or is it more tactical given what else is going on at Boeing?
I think it's tactical. I don't think Boeing can ignore this for too long. You know, they have to get themselves in a corral because there's so many things happening in Boeing at the moment. But I think that won't last. I think they'll be back in. I mean, they've got lots of stuff going on in this space related with UAVs, and they've got the relationship with Bell, and Bell is still very heavily in this sector. So I think they'll be back quite soon.
They've got military interests in this as well, of course, haven't they, with in situ? And they make some drones, Predator drones, that are big enough to have a wake vortex and stuff like that. So
they do. And of course, another big story is that we had a military drone land at an airport for the first time, at a civil airport. So you can feel the pace. This market is taking off, you know.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know if you know this, but there's a quite an interesting history about Boeing and unmanned aviation, and certainly Boeing and Airbus, which I think is really fascinating, which Boeing, of course, has got UPS as a client, or as a customer, I suppose is the right word there. And not just a customer, a really big customer, a good customer. And they put an order for what I think was 80 777s a few years ago. And the first two of those that came off the line, they immediately handed back to Boeing and said, now make these pilotless, please. Because FedEx had worked out that if you take all of the things, if you take the people off the flight deck, you don't need water, you don't need heat, you don't need air, and just as importantly, you don't need all that other stuff in the cockpit. Indeed, you don't need a cockpit. And that they worked out was about 10 tonnes, which is a huge amount of load, a huge amount of lift in a 777. And so Boeing this is all public information, I should add. Boeing was tasked with making unmanned aircraft that flew in controlled airspace a long time ago, in the scheme of this, a long time ago. So what's interesting there is that Airbus doesn't have a FedEx or a UPS client. There are no cargo airlines flying around in Airbus aircraft. Well, traditionally, I mean, nowadays they've taken all the seats out, of course. And that meant that Airbus got into drones and to very much smaller things, which suddenly meant that Boeing had to leapfrog over them, and up came Boeing next and all of that. But it looks like if Boeing has now withdrawn from this space, it's not so much Boeing next as Boeing previous, or
Boeing
past. Yeah.
Boeing past. No, I think they'll be back. I think they have to be back. You know, I mean, you talked about the economics. I was talking to Bobby Healy yesterday of Manor Aero, and they've got this. It's obviously much smaller scale drone delivery operation now in Ireland, from a big supermarket to a local town about half a kilometre away. And they worked out that just doing one drone delivery cost them $1. So in terms of distribution costs, that is such a huge saving. You just can't ignore it. You just can't ignore it.
What's the cost if you use a truck, a bloke in a truck?
Well, I don't know. I think it'd probably be more like a bloke on on one of those little moped things. That was that $7 or $8 for the same kind of delivery.
I mean, what really interesting, and I mean, one of the realities is the big supermarkets, for all sorts of reasons, tend to build those brand new, huge barn-like warehouse things outside cities or outside towns. So by definition, there's a last mile that's literally sometimes only a mile to bridge. But secondly, of course, there's a really interesting conversation to be had here about safety, I think, don't you? I mean, we have regulated this. We have looked at the safety issues around this to say what would happen on standard aviation measures, 10 to the -6, 10 to the -9 and so forth. But maybe we should be thinking about what is the safety compared to the safety risk of having blokes on mopeds and blokes in white vans driving around cities and driving around towns, because that, I suspect that 10 to the -6, 10 to the -9 is never going to happen with road safety.
But also, I mean, that's a kind of, where did 10 to the -9 come from? It came from about 70 years ago when they looked at one small part of an aircraft design. It's not relevant. You look at the entire ecosystem.
You're asking me to start singing here, Phil. I mean, tradition, etc.
Yeah, but I think you're absolutely right.
It's just tradition. I mean, so much of aviation is 70 or 80 years old. I mean, the Chicago Convention, 1944, it's just bizarre. I mean, the single most bizarre bit of that being, of course, that RPAs are even mentioned in them, which, is where did that come from? And the answer, of course, is that in World War II, they were used as target practice. Unmanned devices were flying around used as target practices. And, of course, the first ever commercial photograph or the professional photograph taken of Marilyn Monroe was when she was working in a factory building drones, Okay. She was spotted by a very astute photographer, even then in 1944, 45. There's a photo of that photo in the History of Flight Museum that Boeing runs at Payne Field in Seattle. It's worth going to.
Well, getting a bit off piece, actually, from target levels of safety to Marilyn.
As if Marilyn Monroe wasn't, but yeah.
Yeah, so I reckon it should be somewhere between roads, what we regard as now safe for the roads, and what we regard as now safe for aeroplanes. Somewhere in that space is where we should put it. And
I agree, and even at 10 to the -6, which is of course for the non-critical stuff on aircraft, roads are nowhere near that. Nowhere near that. I can look this up, and perhaps for next time I should. But my memory is that even in Europe, which is extremely safe for road safety compared to a lot of other parts of the world, it's something like 35,000 fatalities a year on the roads, of which, incidentally, by the way, 50% now are pedestrians or cyclists. It's much more dangerous to be on the road as a pedestrian than as a driver. We've made the motor vehicles so safe now.
The difficulty is I bet you're going to get, for all sorts of cultural and technical reasons, different targets of level of safety in China and in Europe and in the States. I think that's going to be a really hard nut to crack, that one, getting everybody to agree a common global target level of safety.
Yeah, I mean, getting everyone to agree that it shouldn't be 10 to the -9 is easy. Getting everybody to agree that it should be something else, 10 to the -1 or something, who knows, that 10 to the -4.5, what's halfway between 10 to the -9 and 0.
Perhaps this is where car manufacturers can teach the aerospace industry something.
Yeah, I agree. That's a really good point. Actually, I really agree with that. And that's one area where Hyundai and Toyota and there are other car manufacturers in this space as well, aren't there?
There are indeed. Yeah. Momentarily they escape me, but you're absolutely right.
I think I read GM the other day is getting
GM are certainly getting into here. I mean, there's been a long symbiotic relationship, actually, hasn't there, between car manufacturers. In fact, Aston Martin, I think, have just done a deal with a helicopter manufacturer to have an Aston Martin helicopter.
Really?
Yeah.
This is for the James Bond film After Next, is it?
I think they might want to sell more than to James Bond, But yeah, so yeah, I mean, I think there's an awful lot. This is because you're going to have to get the ground system connected into the aviation system as well when you look at a smart city infrastructure with the charging points and, you know, all the other stuff. So it does, you know, there does seem to be a lot that these two industries can learn from each other.
That's another really interesting point, isn't it? I mean, smart cities has historically, it hasn't got much of a history yet, but smart cities, the plan with smart cities is all about, has historically been about connecting cars.
Right.
If we extend that out to connect up into the third dimension, up above the cars and so forth, then clearly, it moves into a whole new ball game, if you like. But also, what it does, and I think there's a really interesting point, perhaps for us to talk about next time, is what it does is it highlights the importance of cities in this. Because historically, and I speak here as an aviation guy, you know, we don't worry too much about cities. We fly over cities. We don't think about cities. But this actually is all about connecting the ground, as you say, the ground and the sky. And that's a role not for CAAs, not for aviation regulators, but for cities. I think it's a really interesting point.
And it's a plug here for CIVATA at the end as well.
Well, it is a plug for CIVATA. I mean, yes. Oh, okay. So accuse me of plugging CIVATA. I think CIVATA is an organisation that is absolutely to be applauded for realising early that what we need to do is bring the cities and the operators together, whether they're aviation operators or they're infrastructure operators or they're manufacturers, and whether, again, that's motor car manufacturers moving into flying taxis or airframe manufacturers moving into flying taxis. Doesn't matter. And of course, the other group in all of this, of course, are the air traffic control people, the UTM people in all of this. So yes, it is a shameless plug for CIVATA, but it didn't start that way. It was merely an observation, and I've taken the opportunity of taking it. Always good to talk to you, Phil.
And you too, Andrew. You take care.
I will do what I can, and look forward to doing it next in a fortnight's time.
2 weeks' time. Yeah.
Indeed.
Okay. Cheers.
Bye now.
Bye-bye.